The flak was a living thing over Linz. Black puffs of smoke burst from nowhere, rocking the bomber like a slap from a giant hand. The Dakota Queen groaned, its aluminum skin shuddering. Lieutenant George McGovern fought the yoke with every muscle in his arms, keeping the big ship steady. The Norden bomb sight took control of the plane. The bombardier called out corrections, his voice clipped and strained over the intercom. Mr. McGovern glanced out his side window and saw the city below, marble white with snow, the rail yards a dark web. Then the plane lifted as the bombs fell free. One bomb hung for a heartbeat too long. It tumbled off target, a speck spinning down toward a patch of green. The flash of impact was silent from the cockpit. Later, they would learn it struck a farmhouse. A family. That moment, that white flash, would never leave him. That moment in the spring of 1945 would shape the rest of George Stanley McGovern's life. But to understand how a preacher's son from a tiny town on the Great Plains ended up there, we must go back. Way back to a summer day in 1927, when a 5-year-old boy heard his father tell him about a hero. The news crackled through the radio speaker. Charles Lindbergh had flown a silver monoplane from New York to Paris, alone, without stopping. The whole country seemed to stop breathing. In the Wesleyan Methodist parsonage in Avon, South Dakota, young George McGovern listened to the excited voices of his parents. The boy kept a tattered photograph torn from a magazine. It showed the Spirit of St. Louis, the propeller a blur, the wings stretched thin against a grey sky. He would stare at that photo for hours. He thought Lindbergh was the most glamorous creature God had ever made. 9 years later, the boy was 12, shy and serious. His family had moved to Mitchell, a wind-blown town of 12,000 souls. George's father preached in a small church, and the family pinched pennies. The boy hunted pheasant with his father's single-barrel shotgun. He was lean, a fast runner, but his heart pounded when he looked down from any height. The gymnasium floor shone under the electric lights. Joe Quintal, the athletic director, blew his whistle. He ordered the 7th-grade boys to run at a leather sawhorse and dive headfirst into a somersault. George McGovern ran, but at the last instant his body locked. He balked again and again. Mr. Quintal shouted across the gym, "You're a physical coward, that's why." 60 boys watched. George's face burned a deep crimson. The words sank into him like a cold knife. He could not speak. The teacher's voice echoed in his head, long after the class was dismissed. A sense of humiliation settled deep in his bones. That afternoon he walked home alone. He could not shake the feeling that Mr. Quintal was right. He tried out for the track team the next year, pushing his legs until his lungs burned. He set no records. The taunt never fully faded. In high school he became a quiet, determined young man. He studied, went pheasant hunting, and stayed away from trouble. His father was a strict teetotaler. The boy went to the movies once in secret and felt a thrilling rush of guilt. But the fear of heights remained a private shadow. By the fall of 1940, 19-year-old George McGovern was a freshman at Dakota Wesleyan College in Mitchell. The campus was just down the street from his family home. War was blazing in Europe and China. America was still at peace, but frantic to prepare for what lay ahead. A young man from Custer, South Dakota, named Norman Ray, was obsessed with flying. He had no money, patched jeans, and worn-out shoes. He persuaded George and 8 other students to sign up for a new government program called Civilian Pilot Training. The course offered ground school and real flight hours. George signed his name on the paper. His motive was simple and burning. If he could climb into an airplane and fly it, he could finally look Joe Quintal in the eye. He passed the physical with a near-perfect score on depth perception. His eyes could measure distance with uncommon precision. The airplane was a single-engine Aeronca, built in Ohio, with an open cockpit and a thin fabric skin. The instructor, a bear of a man named Cliff Ferguson, sat in front. George's hands trembled as he pushed the throttle forward. The wings bounced in the gusty South Dakota wind. Fear clawed at his stomach. The ground fell away, and the tiny craft wobbled in the air. John Ferguson shouted instructions over the roar of the engine. George forced himself to breathe, to steer, to look at the horizon. After 8 hours of instruction, the big instructor climbed out and said, "You're ready to solo." He flew the Aeronca alone over the neat green squares of the prairie. He saw the water tower, the Corn Palace, the campus where he had once felt so small. The wind was rough, the plane danced and dropped, but he kept it level. When the wheels touched the grass runway, he knew something had changed inside him. The thirst for flight became a hunger. He saw B-24 bombers for the first time that fall, huge four-engine machines practicing over the Nebraska plains. They landed on the Mitchell runway like ugly giant birds. He watched them taxi and thought, those pilots must be made of iron. On a Sunday afternoon in December, he sat in his dormitory room working on a music report. The room was cold. The New York Philharmonic played on the radio. Then the music stopped, and a voice cracked with urgency. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. He had never heard of the place. His father came in and turned up the volume. The next day, the campus boiled with talk of war. Maps were pinned to bulletin boards. Young men gathered in clusters and spoke in low voices. George and 10 fellow students decided to enlist. They piled into borrowed cars and drove all the way to Omaha, debating whether to choose the Army Air Corps or Naval Aviation. A rumor spread that the Air Corps offered a free lunch voucher for the cafeteria next door. That settled the argument. All 10 young men stepped into the recruiting office and signed the papers. They were not sworn in yet, but they were Air Corps property now. His heart was light, but his mother wept when he returned home. In his sophomore year at Wesleyan, before the Army called, George met a young woman named Eleanor Stegeberg from Woonsocket, South Dakota. She had beaten him in a debate. She had outscored him on a current events quiz. She had a quiet beauty, a reserve that matched his own. He fell in love with a certainty that surprised him. The draft board gave him a reprieve to finish the term. Then, on a snowy February night in 1943, a thick envelope arrived with orders. He said goodbye to his mother at the train station. The band played. The cheerleaders cheered. He kept his eyes off his mother's face because it looked like a funeral. The train pulled out into the darkness. He trained as an air cadet. The Army pushed him hard through ground school and flight school, through single-engine and twin-engine planes until he had wings on his chest. Eleanor followed him from base to base, living in rented rooms and eating peanut butter crackers. On October 31, 1943, his father, Reverend McGovern, married them in Woonsocket. That night, boarding the train for his next base, someone stole their suitcase. They sat on their bag in the crowded aisle, and as Eleanor's lip quivered, both of them just bawled. In November 1943, Second Lieutenant George McGovern arrived at the Army airfield in Liberal, Kansas. He was a newly married man, freshly commissioned, holding orders for B-24 transition training. The winter wind scoured the flat prairie as he walked toward the operations board to find his name. Beneath the chalked list of instructors, he saw it, First Lieutenant Norman Ray. McGovern froze. Norman Ray was the college friend from Dakota Wesleyan, who had talked him into taking flying lessons. Now Ray would be the man who taught him to handle the heaviest bomber in the American arsenal. The B-24 Liberator sat on the flight line like a great aluminum beast. Its twin tails rose 2 stories high. Its wings stretched 110 feet across, a thin raindrop shape designed by an engineer named David Davis. McGovern climbed a ladder into the flight deck and faced a wall of 27 gauges, a dozen levers, and a control yoke as big as a truck's steering wheel. The yoke was not hydraulically boosted. Every turn, every correction, every nudge required raw muscle from the pilot's shoulders and arms. This machine would fight him for 6 or 8 hours at a stretch. Norman Ray offered no warmth and no quarter. He had been in the Army Air Forces for 18 months and was rated as one of the finest bomber pilots in the training command. He looked at his old college friend with a flat, professional gaze. Ray told McGovern the course would be brutal and that he would find no easy hours. During the weeks that followed, Ray pushed harder than any other instructor on the field. If other students practiced a maneuver 10 times, McGovern practiced it 15. Ray's voice crackled over the intercom with constant corrections, constant demands for precision. One night, 50 miles from the base, the sky turned absolutely black. No moon, no stars, no lights on the ground. Ray folded his arms and told McGovern to take them home. The young pilot's mind went blank. He could not remember the radio compass procedure or the heading he needed. Ray's voice sharpened. He said he could not, in good conscience, send a man into combat who could not navigate a bomber back to base. He told McGovern he would wash him out that very night if he failed. The threat was real and absolute. McGovern's hands tightened on the yoke. McGovern forced his panic down and reached for his training. He asked himself the questions Ray had taught him. The instrument settings, the radio frequencies, the course corrections. One piece of the puzzle clicked, then another, and suddenly the whole sequence fell into place. He set a heading and held it. Minutes later, the runway lights of Liberal blinked out of the darkness ahead. Ray said nothing, but McGovern knew he had passed the test that mattered most. On that cold Kansas night, flying by instruments alone, the preacher's son from South Dakota proved to himself that he could command a heavy bomber and a crew of 10 men. By January 1944, the Army Air Forces assembled the men who would fly together, fight together, and perhaps die together. McGovern met his crew in a bare briefing room. His co-pilot was Ralph Rounds, a handsome 20-year-old from Wichita with a quick grin and a fighter pilot's swagger. Rounds had washed out of single-engine training and wanted nothing more than to fly P-51s. Instead, the AAF put him in the right seat of a B-24. McGovern sized him up. Rounds could make anyone laugh, but in the air he flew the big bomber like a pursuit plane, whipping it through turns that made the gunners grip their seats. The navigator and bombardier was Sam Adams, a quiet, intense young man from Milwaukee who planned to enter a Presbyterian seminary after the war. He and McGovern fell into an easy friendship built on books, ideas, and a shared seriousness of purpose. The tail gunner was Sergeant Isidore Siegel, a wiry, eccentric man who slept with a loaded .45 under his pillow and walked the barracks wearing a bayonet strapped around his waist. Siegel was chronically airsick. Every mission, every training flight, his stomach rebelled, but he never asked to be taken off flight status. The flight engineer was Sergeant Mike Valco, 33 years old, the oldest man in the crew by a full decade. He stood less than 5'5". He had worked carnivals and factories in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he carried the hard edges of a man who had fought for everything he owned. McGovern had worried that an older man bristled at taking orders from a 21-year-old pilot. But Valco was submissive to every command, eager to please, desperate to prove his worth. The other gunners filled out the roster. Bill Ashlock from Texas, William McAfee from Michigan, Robert O'Connell from Vermont. 10 men from 10 different states, strangers thrown together by the machinery of war. One afternoon, the crew gathered on the flight line beside their assigned bomber. McGovern looked at the blank aluminum nose and turned to the men. He told them that since he was the only married man aboard, they should name the plane after his wife. The crew voted on the spot. A sergeant fetched a paintbrush, and soon the letters curved across the fuselage. Dakota Queen. Eleanor McGovern, back in South Dakota, carrying their first child, now had a 4-engine bomber bearing her name. The crew felt the pull of that name. It gave them something personal to fight for, something beyond targets and tonnage. During a training flight over the Idaho desert, the Dakota Queen nearly became a coffin. Sergeant Valco stood between the pilot and co-pilot, monitoring the engine gauges and fuel flow. He reached for a switch, and his hand brushed the crash bar. In a fraction of a second, all 4 engines grounded out. The propellers stopped biting the air. The big bomber lurched sickeningly and began to drop. The intercom erupted with shouts. McGovern saw the altimeter unwinding and slammed the crash bar back into position. The engines coughed, caught, and roared back to life. The plane leveled off. The silence that followed was heavy with fear. McGovern did not chew Valco out over the intercom. He waited until the Dakota Queen was on the ground, brakes set, engines cooling. Then he took the flight engineer aside and spoke to him quietly. The near disaster seared itself into the crew's collective memory. From that day forward, every man double-checked the position of the crash bar before takeoff. The trust they had been building cracked slightly, but the way McGovern handled the crisis without public humiliation earned him a deeper respect. The crew saw that their pilot did not panic and did not punish. He led. By the summer of 1944, the training tempo at Mountain Home, Idaho had become punishing. The crews flew formation practice day and night. The B-24 was unforgiving in close quarters. A slight overcorrection on the yoke could send a wingtip slicing into a neighboring bomber. The men learned to tuck their wings within feet of each other, trusting the lead plane's pilot with their lives. One afternoon, a B-25 dove through a practice formation and collided head-on with a Liberator. The explosion took out 2 more B-24s before the debris stopped falling. 24 men died in a single flash of flame. That night, the base chaplain walked through the married men's barracks. He carried a list of names. McGovern sat in his small room with Eleanor, who had followed him to Idaho as she had followed him to every base. When the chaplain knocked on a door down the hall, a woman's scream pierced the thin walls. Then another scream, and another. McGovern held his wife's hand in the darkness. The cries of the new widows, some of them pregnant, echoed through the wooden building until dawn. He never forgot that sound. It was the sound of the war reaching out and touching them before they had even crossed the ocean. In late September, the orders came. The Dakota Queen crew packed their gear and traveled to Camp Patrick Henry, outside Norfolk, Virginia. They boarded a captured German passenger ship, a rust-streaked vessel crammed with 4,000 airmen. The ship sailed alone, zigzagging across the Atlantic to evade U-boats. For nearly a month, the men walked the decks, read paperbacks, and stared at the grey horizon. McGovern carried a letter from Eleanor in his pocket. She was in Mitchell now, living with her family, waiting for the baby. He wrote back often, his words carefully cheerful, shielding her from the cold weight of what lay ahead. The ship entered the Mediterranean and docked at Naples. From there, the crew traveled by truck across Italy to the Adriatic coast. They arrived at a sprawling airfield near the town of Cerignola. Rows of olive-drab tents stretched across the dusty plain. B-24s lined the steel matting runways, their engines coughing blue smoke into the autumn air. The men of the 741st Bomb Squadron, 455th Bomb Group, 15th Air Force, welcomed the replacements with tired eyes. McGovern looked at the bombers, at the flak-damaged wings and patched fuselages, and knew that the training was over. The war was about to begin. October 10, 1944, dawn broke cold over the Cerignola airfield. McGovern was not yet a command pilot. The squadron paired him with First Lieutenant Howard Surbeck, a veteran of the Ploesti raids, who would lead the first 5 missions with McGovern in the right seat. Together they walked the pre-flight inspection of Surbeck's battered Liberator, its aluminum skin sweating in the damp Italian morning. A mechanic, a young man from Ohio, pulled a jagged thumb-sized fragment of flak from his toolbox, a souvenir from a B-24 that had limped back from Ploesti. McGovern ran his gloved hand along the leading edge, the edges of the fragment razor-sharp. He carried it as a talisman, a reminder of what awaited them in the sky. The briefing hut smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. A major pulled back the curtain covering the map. Red strings stretched from Cerignola across the Adriatic to a rail depot just south of Vienna. McGovern studied the flak concentrations marked in concentric circles. The target was a German supply hub. Enemy fighters were expected. The major's voice was flat. He said losses on this route had been running at 12%. Rounds shifted in his chair. McGovern wrote nothing, just stared. The 4 Pratt and Whitney engines coughed blue smoke and then roared. The Dakota Queen shuddered as McGovern pushed the throttles forward. The runway was steel planking laid over Italian mud. The plane gathered speed slowly, groaning under the weight of 5,000 pounds of bombs and a full load of fuel. At the far end, the wheels lifted. The ground fell away. The formation assembled over the Adriatic. 48 B-24s climbed in a slow, spiraling ascent toward 25,000 feet. The first black puff burst 200 yards ahead. It was an ugly flower, oily and solid. Then there were more. The Dakota Queen bucked. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like gravel hitting a tin roof. The odor of cordite seeped in through the open waist windows. Rounds gripped the yoke, his knuckles white. He struggled to hold the wingtip exactly 6 feet from the lead plane. McGovern's left arm ached from the constant pressure. The air temperature dropped to 40 below zero. The bomb bay doors rolled up into the fuselage. Adams crouched over the Norden bomb sight in the greenhouse nose. His voice on the intercom was calm. He said he had the target in the crosshairs. The Dakota Queen flew straight and level. No evasive action. A B-24 in the formation ahead took a direct hit, its wing shearing off at the root and the plane spinning down with no parachutes. Adams called bombs away. The Dakota Queen lifted as the 5,000-pound load released. McGovern banked hard and dropped the nose. The formation broke apart. Flak bursts followed them for 20 miles. The tail gunner reported no fighters. The crew did not speak on the return leg. That evening, McGovern sat on his cot and tried to write to Eleanor. His hand shook. He had seen war now. He could not find the words to describe it. November 15, 1944. The target was Ploesti, Romania, a kill zone. The 15th Air Force had been bombing the oil refineries there for over a year. The Germans had concentrated over 200 anti-aircraft guns around the complex. The Luftwaffe kept fighter squadrons on alert. The mission briefing lasted 40 minutes. The intelligence officer called it the most heavily defended target in Europe. The Dakota Queen's crew walked to the flight line in silence. The formation crossed into Romanian airspace at 23,000 feet. Contrails streaked the sky. German radar had tracked them from the coast. The fighters came from above and out of the sun. Messerschmitt 109s. McGovern heard the nose gunner open fire. The top turret hammered, tracers stitched the air. Two 51 Mustangs dove into the swarm. The fight broke apart into individual duels. The Dakota Queen held its position in the bomber stream. A B-24 on the left flank vanished inside a bright yellow flash. The explosion was silent over the engine noise, but the shockwave slapped the Dakota Queen sideways. A wing, torn loose and burning, spiraled outward. The fuselage split. Debris scattered across the sky. McGovern glimpsed the tail markings. It was the bomber they called Farrington's ship. The Dakota Queen flew on through the smoke. McGovern wrote the letter that night, under a single bare bulb in the tent. His fingers were stiff from cold. He told Eleanor the truth. He wrote about Farrington's plane. He told her he was afraid of dying, that every mission felt borrowed. He said he counted the empty bunks after each mission and could not stop. He told her he loved her. The fire in the metal stove had burned low. He sealed the envelope and sat in the dark. 3,000 miles away, the letter arrived. Eleanor sat in the kitchen of her parents' home in Mitchell. She was 7 months pregnant. Her hands trembled as she read. She knew his handwriting. She could feel the fear in the ink strokes. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with the others. That night, she wrote back. She described the baby moving inside her. She told him his daughter was going to meet him. February 20th, 1945. The target was the Vienna Sud marshalling yards. The briefing map showed a red ring tighter and thicker than any the crew had ever seen. The Germans had reinforced the flak batteries with 88mm guns. The weather forecast called for solid cloud cover over the Alps. The Dakota Queen had survived 23 missions now. The crew moved with mechanical precision through the pre-flight checks. They had done this before. The clouds broke over the target just as the formation entered the Flak corridor. The sky was black with bursts. The explosions were so close the B-24's skin rippled like water. A sharp crack sounded beneath the flight deck. The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped fast. Fluid sprayed across the deck, a thin red mist. The control yoke went heavy. McGovern felt the plane begin to wallow. He shouted for rounds to help him muscle it level. The waist gunner reported a hit. A fragment had sliced through the aluminum and into his leg. Blood pooled on the catwalk. The tail gunner said he was okay, but his turret power was gone. The Dakota Queen slid out of formation, losing altitude. Rounds pulled the throttles back on the right wing. McGovern pulled the yoke left with both hands. The tendons in his neck stood out. The plane slowly responded, grudgingly, like a wounded animal. Valco appeared at McGovern's shoulder. His face was streaked with grease and sweat. He had been checking the engines. He reported all 4 Pratt and Whitneys were holding steady. The manifold pressures were normal. He had been monitoring the fuel flow. He had spotted a leak in the hydraulic line and was already bypassing it manually. His voice was steady. The accident in Idaho was ancient history now. McGovern nodded once. Valco disappeared back into the bomb bay. McGovern nursed the crippled bomber down through the Alps, with minimal controls. The mountains rose on either side. The passes were narrow. Rounds called out airspeed and altitude. The field at Cerignola appeared after 3 hours of grinding flight. McGovern lined up the runway. The landing was hard. The right tire blew on contact. The Dakota Queen slewed sideways and stopped 30 yards from the fuel dump. Ground crews pulled the wounded waist gunner out first. That night, the crew sat in the mess tent. The food was cold. No one spoke. The bunk of a tail gunner from another crew was empty. His plane had disappeared over the target. His personal gear was still under the cot. A photograph of a girl. A half-finished letter. McGovern looked at the empty bunk and then at his own crew. They were still there. They had brought each other back. The cost hung in the air like smoke. March 15th, 1945. 30 missions completed. McGovern's crew was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. Their eyes were sunken, their reflexes slowed. Replacements kept arriving from the States, fresh-faced boys with 100 hours of flight time and no combat experience. The veterans called them replacements. The replacements called the veterans old men. The gap was 1,000 years wide. Morale dipped lower each week. The new pilots were making mistakes. One had stalled on takeoff and killed his entire crew. Another had wandered into a Flak corridor and been shot down. The veterans watched the replacements die and hardened themselves. Rounds stopped cracking jokes. Adams stopped talking about the seminary. The crew flew and slept and flew again. 5 missions remained. 5 missions felt like forever. A letter arrived on the morning of March 15th. The envelope was smudged and soft from the long journey. McGovern recognized Eleanor's handwriting. He tore it open outside the briefing hut. Inside was a photograph. A newborn, wrapped in a white blanket, eyes closed. A daughter, Anne. Eleanor wrote that the birth had been easy. She wrote that the baby had George's eyes. McGovern stared at the photograph. He called the crew together. He handed the photograph to Rounds. It passed from hand to hand. Valco smiled for the first time in weeks. He clapped McGovern on the shoulder. Adams said a quiet prayer. The tail gunner nodded. The news seemed to lift something from the group. They had a reason now. A specific, tangible reason. Not just the country, not just the war. A little girl who had never seen her father. McGovern folded the letter and tucked the photograph into the pocket of his flight jacket. He had 30 missions behind him. 5 remained. He had seen planes explode. He had heard widows scream. He had flown a crippled bomber home on muscle alone. He had not run from any of it. The boy who could not dive over a sawhorse was a 22-year-old pilot with a Silver Star recommendation pending. Joe Quintal had been wrong. The crew gathered around the Dakota Queen that afternoon. They checked the engines, the guns, the bomb racks. They worked together without needing to speak. Rounds calibrated the throttle quadrant. Adams checked his celestial navigation tables. Valco ran his hands over the hydraulic lines. The bond they had forged in Idaho, nearly broken by a crash bar in a training accident, had been tested in combat and hardened. They trusted each other completely. The final push was coming. Intelligence reports showed the Germans consolidating their remaining forces. Rail junctions, oil fields, factories, all needed to be destroyed. The 15th Air Force was planning a maximum effort strike against a target in Austria, a city called Linz. The crew of the Dakota Queen cleaned their guns and loaded their parachutes. The photograph of a newborn girl sat in McGovern's pocket. He was determined to bring every man home. The airfield at Cerignola slept under a blanket of spring haze. It was April in southern Italy. The olive trees rustled in a warm wind. The ground crews moved slowly among the liberators. For the men of the 741st Squadron, the waiting had become its own kind of wait. McGovern still carried the photograph. It showed a tiny face wrapped in a white blanket. He had looked at it every night since the letter arrived in March, but the picture was not the same as holding his daughter. The distance felt heavier with each sunrise. On the morning of April 10th, a dispatch rider kicked up dust. He handed McGovern a thin yellow envelope. It was a telegram from Mitchell, South Dakota. The words were brief and formal. They confirmed the birth of a daughter, Anne Marion McGovern, weight 7 pounds 3 ounces. He read the message silently, then grinned. He found co-pilot Ralph Rounds at the flight shack. He showed him the telegram. Rounds clapped him on the shoulder and let out a whoop. The crew gathered around, passing the thin paper from hand to hand. For a few minutes, the exhaustion lifted. That evening, McGovern sat on his cot. He wrote a letter in pencil by lamplight. He told Eleanor he would be home soon, that their daughter would know her father. He folded the photograph back into his flight jacket pocket. 5 missions remained. 3 days later, the briefing room filled with crews at dawn. The intelligence officer pulled back the curtain on a large map of Austria. A red circle marked Linz, a rail junction on the Danube. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Every trainload of ammunition mattered to what was left of the German army. A second map went up, showing the Flak concentrations. A dense red ring surrounded the target city. Some of the gunners shifted in their chairs. The officer told them to expect heavy 88 fire. McGovern and Rounds exchanged a glance, then looked forward again. After the briefing, the crew walked to the hardstand. The Dakota Queen sat in the pale morning light. Her aluminum skin was patched in a dozen places. Sergeant Valco was already on the wing, checking the Pratt & Whitney engines. He did not look up, but his hands moved with precision. McGovern climbed the ladder into the cockpit. He ran his fingers over the control yoke. Rounds settled into the right seat and began the checklist. The bomb bay doors rolled open below as the arming crew wheeled a load of 500-pounders into place. Every man on the Dakota Queen worked today without wasted motion. The sun climbed over the Adriatic as the engines coughed to life. McGovern thought of the photograph in his pocket. He thought of the Flak map and the narrow streets of Linz. The personal and the operational had become the same thing. The storm was gathering, and the thunder was not far away. Second Lieutenant George McGovern pushed the throttles forward. The four Pratt and Whitney engines of the Dakota Queen roared at full power. The heavy bomber rumbled down the pierced steel planking of the Cerignola runway. It lifted into the pale April sky, bound for Linz, Austria. The formation assembled over the Adriatic Sea. McGovern tucked the Dakota Queen into its assigned position, wingtip to wingtip with the other B-24s. The blue water glittered below them. The white contrails streamed behind. The Alps rose on the northern horizon, jagged and snow-covered. Co-pilot Ralph Rounds monitored the engine gauges. He called out the readings in a steady voice. Flight engineer Mike Valco stood between the two pilots, his eyes scanning the instruments. The oxygen masks made their breath sound hollow. The cold crept in through the aluminum skin. As they crossed the Austrian border, the Flak batteries opened up. Black puffs of smoke bursting around the formation while near-miss concussions rocked the Dakota Queen. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like gravel thrown at a tin roof. The smell of cordite seeped through the cabin. The target was a rail junction on the Danube River. Marshal Tito's partisans had begged the Allies to cut this supply line. German troops and ammunition flowed through Linz to the collapsing Eastern Front. The briefing officer had called it the most heavily defended target left in southern Europe. The formation turned at the initial point. The bomb bay doors rolled up into the fuselage. The slipstream howled through the open bay. The Dakota Queen shuddered. Navigator Bombardier Sam Adams hunched over the Norden bombsight in the nose compartment. Adams had control of the airplane now. The bombsight was linked to the automatic pilot. McGovern kept his hands on the yoke, ready to override if necessary. But for the next 3 minutes, the machine flew the plane. Adams made tiny adjustments with the knobs. The flak grew thicker. A burst detonated so close that the Dakota Queen lifted 10 feet and dropped back. The formation stayed tight. Any evasive maneuver now would scatter the bombs over miles. The men in the waist looked at each other through their oxygen masks. No one spoke. Adams pressed the toggle switch. The bomb rack released. 500-pound bombs fell from the open bay and streaked toward the rail yard below. The main stick of bombs landed on the rail yard. Locomotives exploded. Tracks twisted into the air. The secondary blast sent smoke billowing 1,000 feet high. But the late bomb sailed past the target. It tumbled through the air. It struck a farmhouse on the outskirts of the city. The farmhouse disappeared in a cloud of brick dust and smoke. A German family lived there. A mother, a father, 2 children. They had taken shelter in the cellar when the air raid sirens wailed. The 500-pound bomb penetrated the roof and detonated. None of them survived. McGovern did not see the farmhouse hit. He was too busy flying the plane. Adams reported that the bombs were away. Rounds called out the turn to the rally point. The formation banked south. The flak faded behind them. The Dakota Queen flew home. The crew climbed down from the bomber at Cerignola that afternoon. The ground crew counted the holes in the aluminum skin. There were 17 new ones. McGovern walked to the debriefing. The intelligence officer showed the strike photographs. The rail yard was destroyed. Then he pointed to a small blur outside the target circle. The officer said a stray bomb had hit a civilian structure. The photo reconnaissance confirmed the damage. McGovern stared at the blur. It did not look like much. It was just a smudge on a black and white print, but his mind filled in the details. A house, a family, people who were alive when he woke up that morning and were dead now. The Linz mission was McGovern's 35th. He had completed his tour. He was alive. His crew was alive. The Dakota Queen was battered but intact. He could go home. He could meet his daughter. He could hold Eleanor again. VE Day came on May 8th. The war in Europe ended. The men at Cerignola fired their pistols into the air. They drank wine and slapped each other on the back. McGovern felt the relief and the joy. But the farmhouse stayed with him. It lodged in a corner of his mind like a piece of flak that could not be removed. He wrote Eleanor one more letter. He told her he was coming home. He did not mention the farmhouse. He did not know how to describe it. He did not want her to know what he had done. He only wanted to say that he was alive, that their daughter would have a father. He shipped home in late May. The transport plane touched down at Mitchell Field. He walked across the tarmac in his uniform. His wings glinted on his chest. Eleanor was waiting at the fence. She held a bundle wrapped in a white blanket. Anne Marion McGovern was 8 weeks old. McGovern took his daughter in his arms. He looked at her tiny face. He felt a happiness so sharp it almost broke him. The Dakota Queen had brought him back. The plane that was so hard to fly, so punishing to control, had carried him through 35 missions. The B-24 had kept its promise. The farmhouse remained in his memory. Decades passed. McGovern became a United States Senator. In November 1972, he ran for president on a platform of ending the war in Vietnam. Many people asked him why he was so opposed to the bombing. He told them about Linz. He spoke about the Norden bomb site. He described the precision of the machine. Then he told them what he had learned. No bomb site was precise enough to separate soldiers from civilians. No technology could prevent a mechanical hesitation. No war could be waged from the sky without killing the innocent. A reporter asked him if he regretted dropping bombs on Nazi Germany. McGovern said no. He said the war was necessary. He believed in the cause. He was proud of his crew and his country. But the farmhouse was a wound that would not heal. It never did. In the summer of 1990, an airshow invited McGovern to sit in the cockpit of a restored B-24 Liberator. He climbed the ladder slowly. His joints were stiff. His hair was grey. He settled into the left seat and placed his hands on the control yoke. The instruments were the same. The 27 gauges, the 12 throttle levers, the worn metal where thousands of pilots had gripped it. He looked out the window at the wing, the Davis wing that provided so much lift, the wing that could snap off under shellfire, the wing that had carried him home. He remembered rounds beside him, cracking jokes through the intercom to break the tension. He remembered Valco crawling into the bomb bay to fix a jammed fuel line at 20,000 feet. He remembered Seigel in the tail turret, facing backward, alone with his air sickness and his fear. He remembered Adams saying he wanted to become a minister after the war, so he could spend his life saving souls instead of taking them. He remembered the young men who did not come back. Lieutenant Farrington, the crews he watched disintegrate in midair. The replacements who vanished into the alpine snow. The children in the farmhouse he never saw. He sat in the cockpit for a long time. The aluminum skin was cold under his hands. The engines were silent. The wild blue yonder was just a memory now. But the weight of it would not lift. George McGovern left the airshow and drove home to South Dakota. He had proven Joe Quintal wrong 100 times over. He had conquered his fear of heights. He had commanded a heavy bomber through flak and fighters and mechanical failure. He had brought his crew home alive. The courage he found was real, but so was the cost. The B-24 gave him a life and a burden. He carried both for the rest of his days. If you have a personal story, a family memory, or a historical anecdote from the air war over Europe, please share it in the comments below. We read every one of them. And if you want to support more documentaries like this, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Thank you for listening.